What would you do if somebody asked you to kill a stranger? No reason, just because they told you to kill somebody. What would you do? That is the question at the center of one of the most important studies ever conducted in social psychology. So this lecture marks our start into a new field, social psychology, which is the study of how other people influence our thoughts, our feelings, our identity. So the study I referred to just now is called the Milgram Study, and we will spend most of lecture 20 on the Milgram Study, but we'll also spend a little bit of time on how we are influenced by other people, the power of the group. So the Milgram Study is about obedience. When do we obey? And it turns out obedience is something that is important worldwide. In fact, as members of the state of California, imagine what our lives would be like if people did not obey stop signs or red lights. We're trained to obey under a lot of circumstances. Have you ever had a parent tell you to do something and you asked why, and the answer was because I told you to? But how far can you push obedience? Can you push it to the point where you'd actually kill another person just because someone told you to? It's a heavy question, and this is a heavy study. What motivated it? Well, the answer is World War II. In World War II, the country of Germany was taken over by the Nazi Party. Now, the Nazis were fascists, basically people who believed that whatever they thought was right and what everybody else thought was wrong. And they instilled in people the importance of following or obeying what the Nazi Party and representatives of the Nazi Party told them to do. What the Nazi Party ended up doing was horrific, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But it begged the following question. Could what happened in Nazi Germany happen in other places in the world? Or was this need to obey, even if you were asked to obey a horrible command, was the need to obey something that was inherently German? So again, Nazism is a form of fascism, essentially do what I tell you to do and that's it. They promoted anti-Semitic doctrine. They promoted doctrines against anyone basically who disagreed with them. And Nazi propaganda became a very big and important part of Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. And one of the things that the Nazis liked to do was hold these giant rallies in which everyone was supposed to conform. This was supposed to be conforming to an ideal that, of course, the Nazis defined. One of the characteristics of the Nazi Party's rule was the creation of concentration camps. They were camps, they were also places of massive death. The Nazis killed about 10 million people in these camps. Most of them, 60% of them, were people who were killed simply because they were Jewish. The other 4 million were people who of gypsy descent. They were people who had political views that disagreed. Anybody who the Nazis deemed undesirable. So again, when people look back at World War II and try to understand what happened in Nazi Germany, one of the big questions is, was this specific to something about being German? Did Germans obey Hitler because they have this need to obey? Stanley Milgram, who's an American psychologist, asked the question, is it something about Germans? Or do all of us have a tendency to obey orders, even if the orders are to kill another person? So for the rest of this segment, we're going to focus on the design of Milgram's study. And students in my class will spend a good chunk of time watching a video that shows the Milgram study in action. But basically, here's what he did. He advertised in a local paper for people to participate in an experiment on learning. So if you decided to participate in this study, you would show up at Dr. Milgram's laboratory at Yale University, And when you arrived, there would be another person who also appeared to be a subject in the study. Turns out that this other person was actually part of the study. So there's 3 people involved in the Milgram study. There's the experimenter, and he plays a very important role. He always wears a white lab coat, and he sort of monitors or controls the experiment. There is the learner, who is the person that you think is just like you, but is actually part of the study. He pretends to be a naive subject. And then there's you, the real person who answered the ad in the newspaper. And you are going to be randomly assigned to being the teacher in this study. So you can see here a picture of Milgram asking someone to randomly draw a piece of paper that would assign their role in the experiment. But in fact, there was never a random draw. It was always the real subject was given the role of the teacher, and the fake subject was given the role of the learner. Here's the layout of the room. The fake subject was taken into a back room, and you as a real subject went with him, taken into a back room and hooked up to an electric shock machine. As this fake subject is being hooked up to the electric shock machine, he tells the experimenter that he has a bad heart, and it's important that these shocks not be too strong because it might damage his heart. Then you, as the actual subject, you are brought into another room, and you're told that you need to read a list of word pairs. So imagine shoe, tree, girl, cloud, and you read through that list of word pairs one time, and that the learner's job is to memorize the list. And when you test the learner on their memory for the list of word pairs, every time they get one wrong, you're supposed to give them a little shock. So the cover story is that this is a study of the role of punishment in learning. Now the experimenter, the guy in the white lab coat, sits near the real subject, and you'll see when you watch the video, anytime the real subject has a question or a concern, the experimenter urges the real subject on. Here's a picture of the shock machine that the real subjects use to deliver an electric shock to the fake subject or the learner. And in this shock machine, the first shock gives 15 volts, which is painful but not damaging. There's a lot of levers on this shock machine. Each lever is another electric shock that's 15 volts greater than the previous shock. As you push these buttons down one after the other, the shock increases in value. And you can see down along the bottom of the screen that at the beginning the shocks are slight, then they're moderate, then they're strong, then they're very strong. And towards the end, the shocks get up to extremely intense, dangerous, and XXX, which of course means deadly. Each time the learner gets a word pair wrong, they get a shock, but if they get the next one wrong, then the shock increases. So each time they get another one wrong, the magnitude of the shock, how painful and deadly, potentially deadly the shock is, appears to increase. Now, the learner is not actually shocked, but there's no way for the real subject to know that. And once the real learner starts out participating in the experiment, just as the experimenter described, but then when the shocks start getting painful, to the painful level, the fake subject, the learner, starts complaining. So you start off at 15 and you go in 15 interval increments up. So for every real subject, once the learner made enough mistakes to get up to 120 volts, the fake subject, the learner, starts yelling out, "Hey, this really hurts." Then when it gets up to 150 volts, the learner says, "Oh, that's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart is starting to bother me out now. I refuse to go on. Get me out." Now, you're the person who's delivering the shocks to this guy who's complaining. You would think when the fellow says, "My heart's starting to hurt, get me out of here," the question is, what do you do? Because the experimenter is behind you saying things like, "You must continue. continue, teacher. The experiment requires that you continue. That's actually a very famous line in social psychology. The experiment requires that you continue. Well, no, it doesn't. What do you do? If you keep going, eventually you get up to 270 volts, and at that point, the learner screams in an agonizing, blood-curdling scream, "Let me out of here, let me out of here." If you continue up to 315 volts, then the learner is going to scream, "I told you, I refuse to answer, I am no longer participating in this experiment." If you continue, it gets up to 330 volts. There's an intense and prolonged scream that you hear that you think is coming from the learner. And the learner says, "My heart is bothering me. Let me out of here, let me out of here." And he's screaming hysterically, "Let me out of here." What do? Do you continue to shock him? Or do you say, no, I'm not going on? If you continue, the volts get up to 345. And at this point, the person no longer responds. So it appears that you have killed, or at least placed into a coma, the fellow who walked into this study with you. Now, the key question in the Milgram study is how many people will continue to flip the switch all the way to the point where they believe they've killed the learner. Milgram asked experts all over the country what percentage of people would go all the way to the end of the chalkboard and kill another person just because the experimenter told them to do so. And experts predicted that less than 1% of people would kill someone just because an experimenter told them to do so. Come back and I'll tell you what the percentage actually was. Honestly, it's terrifying.